Please welcome to the stage Gretchen Carlson.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to start by asking, what was it about the medium of documentary that really drew you in? Because you'd written a book previously, Be Fierce, which is really astounding and covers a lot of women's stories. So what did you feel like you could convey differently through this medium?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm so glad that you had a chance to see this documentary, because I think it's really important for women and men across our country to see the real stories of what almost every woman in America has faced at some point in their life. And so to answer your question, I think it's always more, I mean, I'm saying this because I'm a television journalist, but I think it's always more provocative and more emotional to actually put a name to a face. Mm-hmm. And so you can put it in written word, but when you actually see the emotion of these women in these stories and the transformations that they make, you know, some of these women in their early 20s who don't come from a lot, quite frankly, and have the ability now to feel so empowered through being a part of this process. I think that you see that, and it's just so much more compelling to be able to actually visualize that. Yeah.
And how about the process of finding the women that you were going to have speaking on camera? Because some of them you had heard their stories before, and some of them were new to you.
Okay, so here's the sad reality. After my story broke almost 3 years ago, the astounding thing was that women started reaching out to me, first by dozens, then by hundreds, and I was responding to all of them. And then it got into the thousands, and it just kept growing. And I printed off all of their stories in my home office, and I have just stacks of these stories. And I realized, oh my God, this is a pervasive epidemic. And I felt a sense of duty to do something about it and to help them. And all of their stories were profoundly similar and sad, which was, I finally mustered up the courage to come forward, and almost every single one, the same thing happened to. They were promptly blacklisted, demoted, and fired. And 99.9% of them have never worked in their chosen profession ever again. And as a country, we should find that outrageous. And so I wanted to give testament to them, because they really buoyed me in a really dark time by hearing their stories. And that was the impetus for the book. And then geographically trying to just choose 6 of those women, you know, because there's millions of them. And we just wanted to be able to show different professions, different parts of the country, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic classes, because it's pervasive everywhere. But I think one of the most brave things we did in this doc was we took on McDonald's. And quite honestly, no one else would. And I don't know if you saw in the New York Times yesterday, but the story continues, and there are 20-some new cases now, and maybe they will finally have to enact more broad policies from the top down instead of passing along the responsibility and blame to the franchisees.
What was your process for building trust with these women? Because it's such a personal and emotional thing to tell your story that publicly when you're not existing where you have a platform already, and it's not something that you're experienced with.
I know, it's such a great question. And what I have found through this process, and women in the audience who this has happened to, you'll understand this, and men too, that when this has happened to you personally and you meet somebody else who it has also happened to, it's almost like you don't have to say anything. You just look at them and you know. And so I almost had this immediate trust with these women. I will share with you that another network had gone and interviewed 2 of these 3 McDonald women already and never aired it because of fear of advertising dollars. And so these women were already starting with me with, you know, not a tremendous amount of trust. But I think it's almost like this, you know, it's almost like you don't have to say any words, and we immediately had a connection. And I may have had no connection to these women for any other reason in my life, but I had this intense, strong connection because of what we had both experienced.
Did it change the way that you approached interviewing? Because it's something that you're incredibly established at doing and you're very experienced at, but you're coming into a subject that's very emotionally close to your heart in a completely different way. So how was that for you?
Yeah, because as a journalist, you never want to be the story. And suddenly 3 years ago, I was, the story in a really emotional and difficult way. But I think that it was therapeutic for me as well to go to them, right? I mean, you saw me go to all of their homes, their locations. And that helped to build, I think that helped to build the trust, and it helped to build the authenticity of the doc. It wasn't like I was doing these interviews via satellite or sent a producer down there. It was really important to me to establish that connection with these women. And the best part for me was watching some of these women in the doc really change over time and build such great self-confidence in themselves. And so they had gone through a horrific thing, but in the end, they end up being stronger. And it's really set them up in life probably in a better position than even before these horrible things happened. And that to me is the optimistic part of the doc.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people forget that your story broke before Harvey Weinstein, before Me Too was trending on Twitter. And it's something where we didn't have the community and the conversations that we're having now. How did you see the way that the community and these conversations are really changing their experiences of coming forward and telling their stories in this new time?
Yeah, so when I jumped off the cliff, we weren't really having this national conversation. And one thing that buoyed my spirits was hearing from all these other women. I mean, as sad as everyone's stories are, it made me realize that I wasn't alone. And it suddenly shifted away that this whole thing was not about me anymore. This was about all these other women. And it made me feel empowered to help them. And I think that women saw in my story consequences that were swift. And that made them say to themselves, and they have shared with me, wow, if she could do it and that happened, then maybe I can do it and I'll have a positive outcome. And I think it gave women hope. And then also after Me Too, it just gave women the ability, and men, to either put their name and face on it and own it, or still be anonymous. And they still counted, as a story. And I think that's one of the things that has kept this movement alive. The second thing is the American public was pissed off because they were like, whoa, I thought we had solved this problem because we haven't really heard about any of these stories. But why were they not hearing about them? Because the way in which our society has determined to eradicate these issues or get rid of them is two secret venues. One is settlements, where I can't tell you any of the details of my case other than what was public. And the other is through forced arbitration clauses in employment contracts, which send you immediately to this secret chamber instead of an open court system, which is what I'm fighting on Capitol Hill right now. Testified before the House last week to pass a very narrow scope bill that's only 5 pages long, imagine that, that allows gender discrimination cases to not go to this secret chamber. Because what happens is, when it's secret, the woman has this power, and here's the perpetrator. If the perpetrator suddenly knows that the woman might actually have a voice, look what happens. It actually has a dual effect. She has a voice, and so maybe this person actually doesn't do the harassment anymore, right? So it's such an important thing that we change the way in which we have solved these stories in our society. So that's why the American public didn't know about any of these stories, because they've all been going to these secret chambers. And then the third thing I would just say is that I think social media, as much as I don't like it for my teenage kids, has really been great for keeping this movement alive. Yeah.
And the women that you have in this are such incredible, charismatic, strong women. Was it really important to you to change the stereotype of what people see a victim as? It's not someone who's weak, who's powerless. It's just someone who is on the receiving end of someone else's terrible behavior.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's one of the myths that's out there about women who face this. In fact, our own president said that it wouldn't have happened to his daughter because she's strong. Trust me, I'm strong. It can happen to anyone. And that's one of the myths. Also, what are women called when they come forward? Bitch, troublemakers, right? And what's sort of the way in which companies solve that problem is they get rid of the woman. So, and then also, you know, women just come forward because they want to be rich and famous. Yeah, because it's so much fun to have your name dragged through the mud and maligned, you know. So these are the myths that we really need to work on as a culture to actually celebrate women who come forward. But I actually believe in the last 3 years of all the work that I've been doing that the real final part of this tipping point will be men. And men's, you know, trying to stop being enablers and bystanders in the workplace if they know that this is going on. And I know how tough that is because I feature men in my book who did just that. They came forward to support women, and guess what happened to them? They were promptly blacklisted, demoted, and fired. But if we can encourage people running companies, and predominantly those are still men, to say the buck stops with me, and inside the confines of this workplace structure, we're not allowing this, and we're actually going to celebrate women and men who come forward. Imagine how that changes the dynamic, 180 degrees. That, to me, is the final part of the tipping point, and men are a huge part of that equation in helping us.
Have you had a lot of men share their stories with you as well? Because they're also on the receiving end. I think it's 43% of men are also victims of sexual harassment and abuse.
Yeah, I don't know if it's quite that high, but it's definitely an acknowledgement. I mean, at the beginning, I heard from a lot of men on social media, like, don't forget us. Yeah. And that's why I always make sure to include and men. But it's predominantly actually, predominantly an issue that's where the women are the victims. And I actually believe we need to change what we call it, because any woman in this audience knows that when we call something a woman's issue, what happens? There's like this subconscious negative connotation to that. And men sort of feel like they don't have to pay attention to it. Not because they don't care, they might, but when they hear it's a woman's issue, they kind of maybe tune out. So we really need to call it what it really is, which is predominantly a man's issue. And so it's a tangled web to fix this. It's not a silver bullet solution, and that's the other thing I found out. It's, you know, my husband jokes with me, like, how can you be more busy now than you were when you're actually doing like a live TV show every single day? And I'm like, because I'm working on 7 different ways to try to, you know, to try to fix it. Yeah. And I wish it was easier, but we keep plodding on. Yeah.
I'm also interested in how you think allies in the workplace can best support their colleagues. I mean, you have Carla from Telemundo, whose coworker heard some of the sexual harassment and was on her side and was willing to go to bat for her. But also sometimes a woman isn't ready to speak out. And so how do you think colleagues, workers, friends can kind of best be allies to someone who is going through this experience?
Yeah. So from the victim point of view, it's essential that you tell somebody. And it's essential that you have witnesses, because we still live in this he said, she said culture. And as hard as it is to confide in somebody, that is like my #1 recommendation. Yeah. If somebody sees it, then my recommendation is that you ask the person that it's happening to if it's okay if you support her or him in going forward. But there's power in numbers, and especially now, there's been such massive change in a short period of time. I mean, if you just look at the high-profile stories that have changed since my story became public, I mean, 3 things have happened that you could have never envisioned could have happened in just 2.5 years. Women are being believed. I mean, that's huge. Men are facing swift and immediate consequences, and they're apologizing. Those 3 things, I mean, cultural change takes decades. Mm-hmm. And the idea that we've seen that kind of swift change, to me, makes me hopeful every day. I mean, we still have a lot of work to do, but it makes me hopeful. I've heard from some people say, well, businesses think this might just be a passing fad, and that we can just, you know, stay status quo and not really do too much introspection. But I think the more that we have reporting on stories like the McDonald's one in the New York Times yesterday, and when these reporters start focusing on industries where it's not just famous Hollywood people, I think it's really impactful to show that it's happening, you know, at all different levels to all different kinds of people. Yeah.
What do you think about the conversations that keep happening now, where we're already at the point of, do we give these men a second chance? So Louis C.K. is doing comedy again, and I keep reading comments online of people who are like, well, what he did wasn't that bad, but what he did was, but he also blocked women's careers for his own gain. Matt Lauer, we keep hearing rumors that he wants to come back to TV, Charlie Rose and all of that. Do you think there should be any sort of way for men to rehabilitate themselves from these stories? Or how do we move forward?
Not in high-profile jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, why aren't we talking about what happened to all these women?
Yeah.
There could be millions of women out there who have never worked ever again. Yeah. And you know, when we're raised as young girls, at least I hope you heard this, my mom told me every day, you can be whatever you want to be. You're gonna have to work really, really hard, but I believe in you and you can be whatever you want to be. Yeah. And so I believed her. The idea that we have stripped that away from all these women is ridiculous. And I do think the media, even though I'm a member of it, plays into that whole comeback story for these men, because they start asking that almost immediately after they fall. They're not asking what happened to all these women and shouldn't we be trying to bring them back. So it kind of irritates me to see those stories. The Louis C.K. thing, I mean, listen, that's up to the people who want to go see him. It's the same thing when I get the Donald Trump question all the time. Yeah. It's like it's up to the American people to decide whether or not they vote for him again or not. But I wish that the media would stop talking about redemption for these people and really focus on the women's stories. Yeah.
And I was reading a couple of interviews where you talked about another experience that you had very early on in your career when you were interested in pursuing being a journalist, being a presenter, and working in the media. And you had an executive who was supposed to help you with your career sexually assault you. Was there a point at which you kind of stood back and said, do I still want to do this profession? Because one of the things that was really striking about so many of the stories, the Harvey Weinstein one, were how many of the victims of that said, I no longer wanted to pursue a career in this field because if that's what it was going to be like, I didn't want to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had two really horrific experiences that happened to me before I even had a full-time job. And they happened within weeks of each other. And I did think this executive spent the whole day with me because he actually thought I had potential and was smart. You know, this is what happens to women. It's like in a second that your whole aura of self-confidence is just like shattered by one move by them, which happened to me in the backseat of a car after spending the whole day with him, and he was suddenly lunged at me and was on top of me and his tongue was down my throat. And you know, you just go into this panic mode because you don't plan for something like that to happen. And somehow I got the driver to stop the car, I barreled out, and of course I never told anyone. I was a mess, but I never told anyone. 3 weeks later, a similar thing happened with a PR executive in a car again, and he took my neck in his hand and shoved my head into his crotch, and I couldn't breathe. And again, I managed to escape. But I think the moral of the story here is that I never told anyone about that for 25 years until I wrote my memoir, and I never actually called it assault until I was writing this most recent book, Be Fierce, and I had been through my other situation at Fox. And it was only because I was interviewing a woman who had accused Trump of assault. And she said, I was telling her about these stories. She said, well, you realize that was assault, right? And I was like, no. She was like, Gretchen, that's assault. And so I hadn't even called it that to myself. And I think as women, we're like constantly thinking that it's something we did or putting blame on ourselves or we deserved it, and we don't even call it what it really is because we just bottle it up and put it somewhere back in our brain that we never want to go to ever again. So, you know, we have to want to talk about these things, and I think we're in an environment where we feel more comfortable doing that. The only way we're going to continue to solve this is to be more open about it and share our stories and decide that we're going to collectively come together to speak up and do something about it.
Yeah. And I know that you recently added a new chapter to your book, Be Fierce. What was it that you felt that was really important to include that you hadn't been able to include when you first wrote the book, from how much change and shift has happened in society since then?
Yeah, I mean, who would have known so much would change? You know, books are due, and then what actually happened was my book was due like in August of 2017, and early October, the whole Harvey Weinstein thing blew up. And I was actually on an airplane when it was happening, going to Dallas to give a speech, and it was 2 weeks before the book was coming out. Well, I couldn't change the book then. And so the added chapter is all about, you know, how the whole Me Too movement then really cascaded and the floodgates were opened, which was something I could have never, ever predicted would happen as part of this process. You know, I thought I was just going to be home crying every day because I was fired. And the idea that we're now in this new place is just so heartening.
How do you think we can ensure that the media stays interested in these stories? Because it's quite remarkable that we're even still talking about it this far down the line, and it's so important too.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the number one thing that I say to all the women who reach out to me now. You know, from small towns in Iowa to Oregon to wherever, Hawaii, you know, tell your story. Because if the media was ever going to be interested in covering it, it's now. And here's how fascinating that statement actually is, because 3.5 years ago, if I would have said to you that major newspapers and magazines and digital outlets would actually deploy entire teams to cover sexual harassment stories, you would have laughed me out of this auditorium. And I would have laughed myself out of here as a journalist, because guess what? They didn't care. So the idea now that we have the media interested in covering these stories, which is coming at the bequest of the general public who's interested in hearing them, that's my biggest advice to women, is to go liberate yourself and tell your story, because that's the way that you heal, and that's the way we continue to make change.
Yeah. I also love that one of the things that you address early on in your book is the issue that sometimes women are not supporting other women, and it's a really big problem. I've been very fortunate to work a lot of female-driven places, but I've also had some terrible experiences in doing so, as many people have. And it's that idea that women are trying to climb into the boys' club, so they start accepting their behavior. And how do you think we can start shifting and changing that as well?
Mm-hmm. So I think part of that is because so few women actually make it to the upper echelons of the companies where they are. And so if one happens to get there, they're in this conundrum of, do I try and be in the boys' club, or do I try and support the women underneath me, right? And so they kind of get caught. So you know what fixes that? Hiring more women. I mean, paying them fairly, promoting them, and putting them in the boardroom. It's pretty simple. It's amazing to me that it's, you know, it's all intermixed here. I mean, that all of that will help harassment, because guess what happens when you have more women in higher positions? Less harassment. So it's all related, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier about how much we need men in this fight, because as long as they're running most companies, they're the ones that are going to be paying us, promoting us, and putting us in the boardroom. You know, so it's essential that my whole mission is not a male bashing mission. This is a reaching out to men mission to come and join us on this team. And I will tell you that as I did a college campus tour for my book, because I think it's really, really important to get the hearts and souls and minds of our young people on this issue. And I was so glad to see that in almost every college campus where I was, that half the audience were young men. And they truly cared about trying to make this better for their female colleagues. And that gave me great hope as well.
That's amazing.
It is. It is. You know, and I'm a mom, first and foremost, and I've also learned that we do a fantastic job of empowering our girls in our society. I have a just turned 16-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. But what I've learned is that it's actually more important how we raise our boys. Because we can empower our girls to high heaven, okay? But none of that matters if they're going to be not paid fairly and harassed and assaulted on the job. So it really, really is imperative that we teach our boys at a young age, when they're developing all their values and ideals, about how to respect women, and that they take those same values with them to the workplace and treat their female colleagues as they would treat their sister or their mom. And you would think that that's easy, but a lot of these things are being formulated, you know, early on in their lives. And so I should actually be spending all of my time speaking to boys' schools.
Do you think it's just as important to call out microaggressions, in the workplace or day to day as it is explicit behavior? One of the stories that I loved that I was reading was about early on in your career, a job where everyone kept calling you sweetie and honey, and you would turn around and say, hi, I'm Gretchen, until they used your name. And because
those were actually legislators in Virginia.
Wow.
I was the only female reporter covering the governor in 1991. Hard to believe. Yeah. But those were actually members of, yes, elected officials who
shocking.
Who actually also said to me that I should be home barefoot and pregnant.
Because that behavior directly leads to what then becomes more emboldened sexual harassment and sexual
Completely.
abuse.
No, listen, this is what happens inside companies, is that when the small behaviors are accepted and nothing is said about it, then it moves on to the next step. I mean, it's like a kid who takes one cookie out of the candy jar and they get away with it. The next time they take 2, next time they take 3. Same thing with this behavior. So you let the simple things pass by, right? Not simple, but not aggressive. And then the next time they do something a little worse, and it's also, nothing happens. Yeah. And so it ends up being this toxic environment that ends up becoming the norm. Mm-hmm. And people who work within that suddenly don't even realize how toxic it actually really is, because it's just the way of life in their company. So yes, you have to start by calling out what you think are the simplistic things. Otherwise, they grow and grow and grow into worse behavior.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask about the importance, as white women coming into the movement, of acknowledging the work that African-American women very specifically and other groups have been doing long before us. In your book, I was reading about how the first case of sexual harassment was actually an African-American woman, Paulette Barnes, in 1974. We have Anita Hill, who was the first person to testify in that way, Tarana Burke starting the Me Too movement, and how we can really help support the work that they've already been doing and help to elevate it without trying to take away their spotlight and their platforms and their power.
Yes, I mean, it's so important to make sure that every story is told, and that's why I always say it's every race and every socioeconomic background, and to pay credit to them. I really think that, so Anita Hill was one of the first stories I covered as a new journalist, and then I was promptly sexually harassed on the job. I think what happened after her, and by the way, I couldn't believe that she wasn't believed. I mean, I was just a cub reporter, and I remember calling my mom and being like, Mom, did you know that women aren't paid the same as men? I mean, it's not like I was naive, but I just hadn't faced gender discrimination. I was a serious musician as a child, and they just picked who played the best. Like, it wasn't if you were a girl or a boy. So it was startling to me, but I think really her story awakened companies to know that they had to put training in their companies, sexual harassment training. But then what ended up happening was a lot of that training just became cover your ass facade. And then companies realized that they could find that little sweet thing called arbitration and put it into your employment contract, and that was a way to cover up their dirty laundry. So in a way, we didn't make a tremendous amount of progress after Anita Hill, because companies just became more savvy as to how they could put these problems in a box and never let them come out. And so, now I think we've seen some different movements that have happened over time. I'm hoping that this one will continue on and have greater steam than we've seen in the past, but by all means, we have to give credit to those who came before us.
Yeah. Do you view arbitration clauses as something that employees, when they're starting a job and they see that's in a contract, that is a negotiable thing to push back against, or not really at this point?
Not before now, but because they would just say, okay, if you're not going to sign that, then we'll just go on to the next person. So they trap you. And what I say to this whole issue is, why do they have to call it forced arbitration? I mean, if something's forced, it doesn't sound like it's too good for the consumer or the employee. I mean, why not make it a choice? Yeah. That's all my legislation is asking for, by the way. If the woman still wants to go to the secret chamber and she doesn't want it to be public, then that's her choice. But at least give her the choice so that she doesn't feel like she's, there was a dark, dark, dark day for women to find out they have an arbitration clause if they're trying to do a sexual harassment case. Arbitration, I think now, in fact, the young people I've been speaking to, they said, we're going to all go together as a group, and we're going to call for a meeting with HR, and we're going to have a discussion and tell them we don't like the arbitration clause. And so we've seen what happens when employees get together. Look at the Google walkout. What happened after the Google walkout? Google took arbitration clauses out of their employment contracts. So that was started by one woman, and it ended up being a worldwide event. And it shows that one woman can make a difference, but it also shows about just the immense power of the collective. So I would just encourage, anyone who has an arbitration clause, and if you don't want it, that, band together, because we're seeing that happen all across the country.
Yeah. I wanted to jump to a couple of questions that we received beforehand from the audience. The first one from Mylin, who's really asking about, as someone who has an established career, how are you able to best advise and mentor younger women on how to stand up for themselves and to be heard?
Yeah, I mean, just through my own story, toughest decision of my life. I'm not saying that it was easy by any stretch of the imagination. And again, it's the power of numbers. Like, we have to all agree that we're going to do this together. It's really imperative for women to decide that we're going to stop being so nice and that we're going to actually fight for what we deserve. And that has to be something that we decide to all do together. So that would be my advice to my younger self. I wish I would have told those stories earlier. Yeah. And I'm optimistic for the next generations.
Yeah,
that they'll find their voice.
Yeah, and telling them now is just as powerful. The next one's from Jean Marie, who is asking about the upcoming depiction in the Roger Ailes film and the series. And you're being played by Naomi Watts and Nicole Kidman separately in 2 different iterations, but I know that you've said publicly how it's tough because you can't talk about anything, so your story is being told in a way that you have no power over. But that being said, I know a lot of times actors, when they're playing a real subject, will reach out to try and meet that person. Have either of them tried to get in touch with you to kind of learn who you are as a person outside of the things that you're unable to discuss?
I know they've been studying who I am. Listen, I just hope that it's as true as it possibly can be, because it was a really painful experience in my life, and you just want the truth to prevail, but not for me, but for all other women. Yeah. Because, and the good thing about them doing these 2 projects is that it keeps the issue top of mind, right? Yeah. And so it gives people the jumping off platform to keep discussing this issue. So listen, I'm just flattered that the 2 of them even knew who I was and are interested in doing the roles, because I think it's really important that we keep talking about it.
Yeah. And I wanted to finish by asking you about the upcoming projects that you're still doing with Lifetime. You've got 2 more projects in development that are shooting soon. What do you feel like you still really need to convey that you want people to hear with these projects that you haven't yet had the chance to cover with what you've done so far?
Yeah, so we're not discussing yet what they're about, but we are in the planning stages, and we're going to start shooting in June, and they're probably going to be released in October. Yeah. So stay tuned for that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for all of the incredible work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.